The battle for el-Fasher. There's fierce fighting for the capital of Sudan's North Darfur state, with human rights violations being reported. Just how important is this region in the year-long conflict? And what role are outsiders playing? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Fighting is intensifying in Sudan's western Darfur region. The paramilitary rapid support forces are advancing on the city of el-Fasher, the Sudanese army's last stronghold in the area. The year-long conflict across the country has displaced millions of people and left many more on the brink of starvation. The UN Security Council is seeking to address the crisis at the request of the UK, but so far actions by the international community have proved ineffective. So is the conflict in Sudan reaching a critical point? And can anything be done to protect civilians caught in the crossfire? We'll get to our guests in just a moment. First, this report from Mohamed.
The Sudanese army and paramilitary rapid support forces have been fighting for more than a year. But now the conflict may be approaching a pivotal moment as RSF fighters close in on the city of el-Fasher. The northwestern region is the last stronghold of the Sudanese army in Darfur. As the fighting intensifies, the civilian population is caught in the middle. More than 10 million people have been forced from their homes across Sudan and are living in desperate conditions.
Our lives have become difficult. Now, as you can see, we don't have anything, not even dinner for our kids. We fled from Tawila. We had to leave at night. We couldn't leave during the day because we were scared of strikes and heavy weapons.
Food is also running out. More than 18 million Sudanese are going hungry, and aid isn't getting through to those in need. Humanitarian workers warn that conditions will get even worse unless something changes soon.
We need an end to the conflict. At a minimum, we need a ceasefire. We need to be able to scale our operations, and for that we need the humanitarian access. We need long-term political intervention that will allow the peace to hold.
Prosecutors from the International Criminal Court are investigating possible war crimes in Darfur. They believe widespread atrocities are taking place.
The evidence my office has collected to date seems to show credible, repeated, expanding, continuous allegations of attacks against the civilian population. In particular, attacks directed against camps for internally displaced persons.
As the conflict goes on, more civilians are being put at risk. But so far, the international community has had little success in securing humanitarian access or bringing the fighting to an end. Mohamed, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests now. And in Cairo, Dallia Mohamed Adelmoniem, a Sudanese political commentator and analyst. In Nairobi, Mathilde, advocacy advisor for the Norwegian Refugee Council. And in Kampala, Hala Alkarib, a Sudanese pro-democracy and African feminist activist and regional director of the SIHA network. A very warm welcome to all of you. Hala, let's start with you, because Fintan there, he gave us a pretty good idea of the terrible situation that the people of Sudan are facing, especially at the moment in el-Fasher city. What more can you tell us about what's happening there?
Well, the city is under attack at the moment. There is fighting in all directions, and there is a very strong pushback from the joint forces and Sudan armed forces who are barricading inside the city. Most of the attacks are happening on civilians' facilities, particularly civilians' homes. My colleagues who are working on el-Fashers, their homes has been completely destroyed. We used to have a small adult literacy center in Abu Shokam. It's completely doesn't exist at the moment, completely wiped, from the face of earth. There is a lot of casualties. There is people who are getting killed randomly, and part of the city neighborhoods has been fully occupied by the RSF. Of course, we know that most of the hospitals are not functioning at the moment. So it's a very dire situation at this point in time.
Mathilde, we're talking about upwards of 800,000 people trapped in this urban area as this fighting rages. I mean, the scenes that Hala is describing, buildings demolished, hospitals not working, also hearing reports of food, aid not being able to reach anyone. This is an absolute crisis, and yet it's not making the headlines. Why not?
It's an absolute nightmare. It hasn't been, on the headlines at all, although it's been ongoing fighting, daily fighting, people dying every day. Not every day until since the past 2 months. It's been like this for 14 months. The capital has been exploded. The entire region of Darfur has been burned to the ground. People have been fleeing in mass. Sudan is the largest displacement crisis in the world and is about to be the largest food crisis in the world. And right now, just before our eyes, we have one of the largest cities of Sudan being completely destroyed, as it was just described. I don't know, I cannot understand how neglected this crisis is compared to the tragedy that is ongoing. And I don't think the international community has really paid attention enough over this past 13 months. And still now they're not gathering together to stop the fighting and to raise it at the highest level.
Dallia, can you shed any light on this? I mean, the world's largest displacement crisis, the world's worst hunger crisis, this is what the UN is saying. Is this a forgotten crisis, or do people simply not know what's going on?
It's a combination of several factors. I think it's an ignored war. It suits the purposes to certain political entities that no one discusses, no one talks, no one knows about the war in Sudan. And at the same time, I think there's also inherent bias involved, as in this is another war in Africa. They've always had trouble, conflicts. Sudan's history is riddled with conflict. And so it's brushed off as another conflict in a troubled country. But I would like to add one thing. The number of people killed in Sudan is more than 15,000. The UN keeps trotting out this number, and it's disingenuous because in el-Geneina alone, last year, more than 15,000 were massacred in el-Geneina. The correct figures are close to 150,000 people killed. And that's not even officially, but it's approximate in the past 14 months. And politically, Sudan has been sidelined. Yes, there are a number of conflicts happening in the world, but the spillover from the Sudan war is tremendous. It affects the whole region. It could easily affect the whole continent of Africa. And nothing is being done. The shuttle diplomacy that so many countries are known for is seriously lacking when it comes to Sudan.
Dallia, let me just jump in there and pick up on one point that you made just before you made many other excellent points that I hope we'll get to later in the discussion. You said this suits political entities, certain political entities. Can you elaborate on that and tell us who?
Well, both armies have backers. The UAE has been confirmed that they back the RSF. And the army is being supported by the Egyptian government to a certain extent, and right now Iran, and they're trying to sign a deal with Russia. So, and when it comes to the UAE, there's also Chad is involved. The Wagner Group has a role to play, and so these entities are in a way the puppet masters of this war. And not enough pressure has been applied on both of them, on both backers of both military armies, to ensure that a ceasefire is actually holds, that safe passageways for aid is made, safe passageways for civilian evacuation. Nothing. The only time civilian evacuation was actually upheld was when foreign nationals were allowed to leave. Other than that, there's never been a safe passageway for Sudanese civilians. 10 million people displaced is not a small number. It is a significant, it's nearly a quarter of the Sudanese population, a quarter.
Hala, I want to get your thoughts. Let me just bring Hala in at this point. I want to get her thoughts on these outside agents, these countries that are fueling the war, the UAE, Iran, they are being accused. What do they stand to gain from being involved in this conflict?
So that's a good question that we have been asking constantly as civilians and as activists who has been observing and being part and suffering out of what's happening in our country. And that's $1 million questions. What are there to gain, out of this mass destructions and violations that's happening every day and the bloodbath that's taking place in Sudan? And, I just would like to take a step back and speak a little bit about the neglection of the Sudan questions that has happened since 2019, since the falling of Bashir regime, and how, both the international community and the transitional governments and the military elites of Sudan, they have not taken seriously the volatility and the risk that the country was confronted with post-Bashir. The conflict in Darfur never ends, and it never stopped. The RSF and their allies, militia, they have been continuously active, and violating the local populations and the rural populations across Darfur and in many parts of Kordofan. So there is a lot of issues that was allowed to be exacerbated, and I think, the transition in Sudan has been looked at very lightly. And right now, as we are paying this hefty price for the neglections, and for the fact that the situation in Sudan has not been taken seriously, and we are navigating this crisis, we were also being left alone. And as Dallia said, the issue of protection is not an issue that's centralized in the conversations. While the current crisis in Sudan, it's about protections, because civilian bodies are primarily used as weapon of war in this conflict. Yes, it's a conflict between two belligerents, but it happens inside civilian facilities, inside civilian homes. And this is what we have been enduring. So the level of atrocities, and casualties is extremely high, very, very high.
Mathilde, accusations of atrocities have been levelled at both sides. The RSF, though, does seem to be particularly brutal when it comes to dealing with the local population, the civilian population. It's been connected to massacres, it's been connected to sexual violence, starvation. Why is this the RSF's method of warfare?
I don't think I could understand the psychology of the RSF warfare, but it's totally right. Like, the war has been fought on people's body, on women's body, on people's home, schools, hospitals. And the characteristic really of this war is that every single day, international humanitarian law has been blatantly violated. Just last week in Al Jazeera, which used to be the breadbasket of Sudan, 100 villages and perhaps more, 100 villagers, were killed in a mass massacre, really, just in one day. People in use of high-level weapon, just like that. And, again, like what has happened in el-Fasher is terrifying, and it's really the echo of what has happened twice last year, where you have an entire population that has been disseminated in West Darfur, so not very far away from el-Fasher, because of their ethnicity. And those who survive had to flee to Chad because it was just impossible to continue being in West Darfur and being attacked for who they were, which is mass elite population.
Dallia, the US envoy to Sudan has warned that el-Fasher could fall imminently to the RSF. If it does so, it has then taken over the whole of Darfur region. What do you think it's going to do with that? What's Hemeti's plan for Darfur?
Annihilation of the people of Darfur. He has precedents, he has history. This is what the RSF, formerly known as the Janjaweed, did 20 years ago. They committed genocide, and they're committing genocide right now. There's a lot of play here. There's cultural, there's politics, there's just power play. All of it is involved. And if el-Fasher falls, then the RSF will, in a way, end up controlling 60% of Sudan. A militia will be in control of 60% of Sudan's land. And they've shown in the past 12 months alone just how much of a genocidal, massacring entity they are. And they continue to do that in plain sight, and no sanctions have been placed on them, no punishment has been meted out on them. I would just like to go back to your point as to what do the other countries or other nations have to gain from being involved in Sudan. It's a form of neo-colonialism. You're talking about resources. Sudan has rich agricultural land, has minerals, has gold, has access to the Red Sea. So you're talking about geopolitics. You're talking about a form of new power play in the region, and of countries, expanding their territorial interests beyond their own borders. And if that means moving into new territories, and Africa, it's like a new scramble for Africa. Only this time it's done by new players in the political field as opposed to the traditional colonial powers. So this is what's at play. And people, the international community will only wake up when it's too late, when it's far, far too late for anything to be done. And by then, I hate to say it, but what will be left of Sudan, I don't think anyone knows, but it doesn't bode well. And
Hala,
I know that the US...
Okay, let's bring in Hala at that point, because there have been peace efforts, multiple peace efforts, in fact, by the international community. But at every step, they have failed and they have been forgotten. Why is it so difficult for the international community to come together to stop this war?
I think the modalities of peace engagements or the attempts of peace efforts around Sudan has consistently been emphasizing or focusing on, power sharing formula. And that has been the case many, many times. And that's the main reason of the fact that we keep going on cycles of violence, because there has not been significant investment, neither by the international community. And I would like not to centralize the international community alone, but I would like also to speak about Sudan political elites as well, who there is a serious issue of lack of learning from the past mistakes and emphasis on issues of power and control without any clear elements of political projects and learning from the past experiences. The other issue that's constantly leading to a failed disagreements is the lack of accountability and the significant level of impunity that keep happening. The RSF has been so emboldened and so empowered to commit such atrocities for over 20 years. And so when they launched their war in Khartoum and in Jazeera, and they repeated exactly what they have done in Darfur, in terms of destructions of rural communities, of infrastructure, of transferring productive communities, productive farming communities into displaced community and impoverish them and exercise massive dispossessions and trauma and sexual violence. That has happened before over the past 20 years, not into this scale, but it happened before and they got away with it. Contrary, the RSF has been rewarded by Sudanese elites. RSF has been rewarded by the international community, looking at how the Sudanese elites, they don't mind, engaging with the RSF and thinking that they could utilize them as proxy forces, to serve their purposes. And at the same time, the paramilitary force has came to a clear understanding that they are not proxy anymore.
Okay. Dallia, I just want to ask if you agree with that one of the key issues here is that all the actors in Sudan believe, probably rightly, that they can act with impunity. And I mean, you mentioned before at the beginning that it is extraordinary, or that we don't even know how many people have been killed. And that in itself is extraordinary, that we do not have a clear number. It ranges from 15,000 to 150,000. No one is watching this. There are no cameras there. There is no journalists. They can act with impunity, can't they?
They can, and they are. And they have, if you just look at our recent history from the post-revolution, the massacre at the sit-in, no one was ever held accountable. The genocide of Darfur, no one was held accountable. If you do not have justice and if you do not have accountability, then this is what you will end up with. A war between two power-hungry generals, and doesn't matter who gets caught in the middle, which is always the civilians, and a political system that is just not too interested in what's happening. And they will only get involved when it actually impacts them directly. And we'll probably see more involvement when more displaced people try to cross into European countries or try to find, safety somewhere else.
Well, absolutely. I mean, a lot of people, Mathilde, already have escaped and probably will be trying to escape into Chad. Is that route still open to people?
Depending on where they are. A lot of people right now who are in el-Fasher are trapped. I have a colleague who just left el-Fasher last week. It was a very treacherous journey that lasted 4 days. And he had to cross through a desert. He had to cross through different checkpoints, or every time being, fearing to be detained or perhaps attacked or perhaps killed. You don't escape el-Fasher easily. Actually described it as an open prison. So the people that we are seeing in Chad right now are the ones who survived. There are also people who are arriving in Chad not because they're fleeing violence, but because they're fleeing hunger. That's something I want to insist. It was earlier said that Sudan has a lot of resources, including agricultural resources, and I was indeed one of the breadbasket of the continent. Right now, you have at least 18 million people who are highly food insecure, who can barely eat. And we have probably more than 5 million people who are at the risk of famine, if not already in famine. And when I say barely eat, it means that my team are telling me in Darfur, what they see is that people are eating leaves, they're eating soil, they're eating 1 meal a day if they're lucky. We have women who have to engage into transactional sex in order to afford food. I've heard about families having to sell their roof. They live in little shelters that made of nothing, and they have to sell their roof in order to get something to eat. So, the situation is terrible, and people are not only fleeing, the battleground and the bombing and the indiscriminate violence and the raping. They're also fleeing hunger.
Hala, there was a Paris donor conference just recently that managed to raise $2 billion in pledges, not actual money, but pledges. There is money to be given to agencies to get food in, but why? What are the obstacles to getting the food from the agencies into Darfur region and to the people who actually need it?
Right now, the whole country is going through a very serious war. So every corner of the country, even the so-called quote-unquote, relatively safe states under the control of SAF, all the states, the territories that the RSF is imposing control over it, they are still, a violent territories. So this is one thing. The issue of protection, and this is why I'm saying that Sudan crisis, is the protection crisis. And I think it's one of the biggest protection crises that happened in Africa. So the lack of protections to a large extent, it hindered the access of it. Also the lack of infrastructure to process it. There is a lot of bureaucracy, there is a lot of hindrance that's happening in Port Sudan side, but also from the RSF side, and the fact that, the conditions of Sudanese civilians is not a priority to any of the actors who are around Sudan at the moment. And that's really one of the big challenges.
Okay.
So,
Dallia, I also want to bring you in at this point because I saw that you had quite a reaction when I mentioned the Paris Donor Conference. What did you think of that?
I mean, like you said, they've pledged, but nothing has been given. I think the aid fund for Sudan stands at 2.2 billion and only 12% has been covered. And yet in January, the EU just signed off on a 50 billion aid package to Ukraine. Sudan needs 2.2 billion. You have a famine, you have people dying of hunger. You have people in refugee camps where a lot of agencies have had to stop operating because they do not have, the required medicine or food supplies. And it's just funny. I mean, they all pledge, but nothing has come through. Like they say, you can walk the walk, but can you talk the talk? And until the money gets down to the agencies, albeit I do agree that both sides are hindering the delivery of aid, and they're also hindering in terms of, giving permits to aid agencies and aid workers and visas, and they tax them. And there is a lot of other factors involved. But agencies have a way, they know how to deal with both sides to ensure that they get through to the people who need it the most. But if they don't have the money,
Mathilde,
they can't do that.
I just want to get one last thought from you. What happens if nothing is done?
The obstruction of access. I've never seen that in my career. It's one of the most difficult country to work in as a humanitarian because warring parties have systematically blocked aid agencies from reaching people. And I can tell you what's happening right now is that the reason why people are surviving is because we have local volunteers, Sudanese, who are on the ground, on the front line, risking their lives to save their peers. Just yesterday, 8 community workers were killed in el-Fasher. These are volunteers. They're not wearing any logo, any NGO, logo. They're just doing it, out of themselves, and they're running soup kitchen and shelters, and they're helping with safe space for children in Khartoum, in Darfur, in Kordofan, and these ones are also being attacked. So it's not only about reaching the population in need. It's that when you're there, you also of dying.
And there we have run out of time. It was a very strong and vital discussion, though. Many thanks to all of you for joining us here today. Dallia, Mohamed, Adelmoniem, Mathilde and Hala Alkarib. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, bye for now.